The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jennifer Kraus. I am the Chief Scientific Officer for Source Intelligence. I am so grateful that you all have joined us today for our webinar entitled Successfully Driving ESG Initiatives Throughout Your Supply Chain. We've got a really superb panel of speakers here that are going to be sharing some terrific insights with you. But before we get started, I've got just a couple of housekeeping items that I wanted to share with you. First of all, if you have any questions you would like to ask of our speakers, please enter those questions into the question portion of your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll be collecting and rounding those up throughout the webinar, and then hopefully we set aside some time so that we'll be able to address those at the end. Couple of other things on your panel: you can access webinar resources as well. There's a handout on there at the moment. These slides will be emailed to all of you that have registered, as well as a link to the recording so that you'll have access to that. And if for some reason you think of questions after the webinar, all is not lost. You can always email us at marketing@sourceintelligence.com, and we'd be happy to field those for you. So the plan for today is I will introduce our speakers in a moment. We're going to sort of set the stage for ESG reporting is how we're going to start out our conversation today. We're going to cover ESG risk mitigation and reporting solutions, and finish up the day with a case study that looks very specifically at ESG reporting and how a real success story with regard to ESG reporting. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we're hoping to save some time at the end for questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. David Meyer is a principal consultant and BSI consulting practice, regional practice leader for sustainability and management systems. He's located in Portland, Oregon. They're getting ready for a bit of a heat wave, I understand. He's an EHS and sustainability focused practitioner. He's got over 40 years of experience in corporate governance, environmental health and safety compliance issues. Dave has supported a wide range of clients providing EHS management systems and supplier responsibility audit support. He's got a deep track record of success in leading organizations in leveraging regulatory compliance and organizational risks and identifying methods and practices to reduce waste in production of consumer and industrial goods. He's a qualified ISO 14001 and 45001 lead auditor, and he's also trained to ISO 50001. He is accomplished in the public and private sector. His 8+ years of experience with BSI have been focused primarily on responsible supply chain management. And we're very thrilled to have Dave with us today. We also have Mary Lou DuPont. Mary Lou is Senior Manager at the United Nations Global Compact. It's the world's largest voluntary corporate sustainability initiative. She is currently leading the Action Platform on Decent Work in global supply chains. It's a group of multinational enterprises and partners that are committed to take action and develop tools for improving working conditions and human rights in their supply chains. Mary Lou joined the UN Global Compact in 2018 after working as a legal expert at the OECD, supporting the Responsible Business Conduct workstream. She has also advised French business associations on the applicability of the French duty of vigilance law. She's a lawyer by training. She worked alongside Canadian Indigenous communities, advocating for rights and sustainable development. So Mary Lou, welcome. We're happy to have you as well. And last but certainly not least, we have Sharon Vidal. Sharon is the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility for Illumina. Since joining in Illumina in 2016, Sharon has led the CSR program evolution embedding social responsibility and sustainability into their global business. Sharon has over 20 years of experience working on multidisciplinary environmental health and safety, sustainability, and corporate social responsibility programming. She has a strong background in the life science industry and holds a Bachelor of Science from our very own UCSD here in San Diego. So welcome, Sharon. There have been some very exciting things happening over the last, just over the last few weeks and months in the ESG arena. For those of you that were paying attention to the news, I think it was just last week, the U.S. House of Representatives just passed the a requirement. This is the Corporate Governance Improvement and Investor Protection Act. So this would require public companies to report ESG metrics. And we've also had some statements from the SEC that has talking about it may be proposing new rules on ESG disclosures as well. In fact, maybe as soon as October of this year. So exciting developments going on. I don't want to take up any more time. I'd like to get started. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Mary Lou, for your presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for inviting me to present the United Nations Global Compact. And such a privilege to be with David and Sharon on this panel. I'm very much looking forward to hear more about, you know, what they see in their work and how they can help companies through their experience reporting on sustainable development goals, or just goals to advance society goals, if I can say. So let me just get started on what the UN Global Compact is. We had a pretty good introduction from Jennifer, but I'll go into a bit more details on what this is about. So the UN Global Compact was initiated about 20 years ago by Kofi Annan to give a human face to the global market, recognizing that the goals of the UN and those of businesses can actually be the same. So it's actually a call to all to companies to align strategies and operations with universal principles on human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. Now that the Sustainable Development Goals have been launched a couple of years back, also a support for companies in advancing these goals. We have about 12,000 companies, a bit more than that now since the slides were developed. We actually had a lot of more companies joining during the pandemic, as I think this was a good momentum for companies in realizing the power that they have in impacting society. So about 12,000 companies, a bit more, 3,000 non-business organizations with who we partner to, again, to achieve those goals. In practice, what that means for companies who join the United Nations Global Compact is a letter of commitment by their CEO to the UN Secretary General himself, and an annual communication on progress on the implementation of the principles. We currently also have 69 local networks to support companies at the local level. And if you're calling in from the States, I must say that the US local network is just absolutely fantastic. So I would really encourage you to reach out just to learn more about their activities. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So these are the principles, what we call our 10 principles, which derived from international conventions and standards. I'm going to focus on the social one. This is more my expertise. I'm mainly working on the labor principles and in the space of decent work, as well as obviously human rights principles. But you have the slide, so this gives you an idea of what they entail basically. And on human rights, under human rights principles, for instance, they align with the UN guiding principles for business on human rights, which, if you're not familiar with what we call the UNGPs, is they clarify basically the corporate responsibility for companies to respect human rights, regardless of what national legislation or practices might be saying or might be lacking. So it's an independent responsibility for business to respect human rights, including in their supply chains. This is very important also in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. About 90% of the 169 or something targets are linked to the international human rights or labor standards. So obviously the social element of it is very important. And as for the 4 labor principles, they are championed by the International Labor Organization, and they are the 4 fundamental principles and rights at work, which all UN member states have committed to implement, even if they haven't ratified all the conventions. So they are really core to UN values and mission. If you can go to the next slide. So here is a picture of the SDGs. I would assume most of you have at least once saw that nice map of the 17 goals. They are the blueprint to achieve a more sustainable future. They address the global challenges that we face: poverty, inequality, climate change, environmental degradation, peace and justice. They were adopted by all member states in 2015, and we have a pretty tight deadline to achieve them. Actually, 2030 is the deadline that the world gives itself to achieve these big goals. They are the results from a process that was quite inclusive, and although sometimes they feel like they are more applicable to governments, they involved business, civil society, and citizens. And now I think it's largely understood and admitted that companies are necessary and should be working toward achieving these goals. If you can go to the next slide. This is basically what we see ourselves as the challenge that is faced by companies, and we do try to organize our work to be able to support companies for all these questions. How to get started. About 60% of our signatories are small and medium-sized enterprises. So how to get started is obviously a big question. How do I know what goals to set? How do I report on them? How do I measure against other companies? I think one thing that is very important about the UN Global Compact is that it really offers that platform for companies to connect with each other across countries, across industries, and they really encourage companies, no matter where they are on their sustainability journey, to engage. So it's just a good way to partner, to find inspiration from what other companies are doing, and also learn more about challenges that might actually be common to most companies. The big challenge that we work with, that appears from all our surveys, from our personal experience with our engagement with companies, from our local networks, is this implementation gap. I think we are at a stage where companies do have, or at least many of them do have, a pretty good understanding of what type of policies they should have in place regarding these principles. Although I always think that it's easier for the environmental space than it is for the social space. Sometimes a bit trickier to really truly understand how to, or the type of policy commitment in the social space that would reduce risks of impact, and actually more than that, just ensure positive impact, not just reduce negative impact. But that being said, that was not my point. It's just that everything shows the implementation gap is where we should be working with companies, from policies to implementation, and specifically for the supply chain. Here you see a number, 17% require the implementation of the 10 principles or the Sustainable Development Goal within their supply chain. This means not that much emphasis on procurement, for example, which I think is very much important to scale up these good policies and ensure that the products are free of human rights violations or labor violations or environmental violations. So that was just a picture to show you where companies, or at least companies that engage with this, with the UN Global Compact, where they struggle, which I can probably assume that this is also something that resonates for many of you. Now I just wanted to, if you could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, I just want to give you an example of one way we engage with companies, and Jennifer said it at the beginning of the presentation, leading the Decent Work in Global Supply Chain Action Platform. So these are basically working group with a number of companies, a number of our local networks, to ensure that we stay connected with also national realities and partners. For the Decent Work Action Platform, we have the International Labour Organization, we have UNICEF. Obviously, this is very important for the children's rights and child labor component of decent work, and the Global Deal, which is the OECD, International Labour Organization, international organization working on how you can advance decent work through social dialogue. And we really just do that, looking at how companies can, through collective and individual actions, advance decent work in global supply chain. What does decent work mean? That's a pretty vague concept, but it has a pretty specific decision, looking at incomes, looking at discrimination, gender equality, again, the capacity for workers to express their needs and opinions as it relates to their working arrangements. All these things, we decompose the definition of decent work. We look at the challenges. We take inspiration from what other companies are doing, and we create partnerships, either within these action platforms or outside with key partners, key other partners, because I mean, I think at the end of the day, partnership is really the key for whatever we do in the social space. A company alone doesn't often have the leverage necessary to make the changes that are needed. And child labor or forced labor are a very good example of that. New numbers were just published by the International Labour Organization. 20 years of progress on child labor, swept out with COVID, 160 million of children in child labor. And this is just basically an estimate. I think it is already a very shocking number in any case. And yes, and the one thing that I didn't want to forget to tell you is that we also have, for example, an action platform on reporting on the SDGs, working with partners such as GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, as well as PRI, the Principle for Responsible Investment. So that was just a piece of information. And within the action platform, the Decent Work Action Platform, and you see it on the screen, we've been working with a number of companies, and I mean, this is all public. If you go on our website, you see everything that we've done. Everything that we do at UNGC is for the public good. It's free, no matter if, it doesn't matter if you're a signatory or not. You have access to all the material that we develop within these action platforms or with partners. And we've been working with these companies, local networks, and partners for a couple of years now, and we're at a stage where, apart from, again, looking at the different parts of what decent work means, we also want to look at the root cause for decent work deficit, and also how you can look at these issues on, with a more holistic approach. And there was a very conscious decision from participants to start looking at the impact that companies have on poverty, wages being the leverage that they have to impact poverty, knowing that poverty is a root cause for human rights violations and decent work deficits. So by not looking, although it seems like a very challenging topic, by not looking at these issues, you cannot really move the needle on child labor or forced labor or safety and health, for example. So that's what we have been doing in the last couple of months, working on guidance, on tools, connecting with stakeholders, and we've come up with very good guidance on improving or on becoming a living wage employer, looking at own operations, as well as what you can do to improve wages globally, in particular through your procurement practices and the way you engage with suppliers. And Jennifer, I do have a few more slides, but I might be running out of time. So maybe I should stop here, or you give me one more minute?
Yep, I was just going to say you got one more minute, Mary Lou, and then we'll move on. Thank you.
Sounds good. So if you can, oh, you're already on the next slide. So here is again another example of one of the way we engage with companies. I want to talk to you about the SDG Ambition. It's a new program. It's called, it's actually what we call an accelerator program that is run by local networks to ensure that we have that national component as well. And within the SDG Ambition, and maybe you can go to the next slide. What we look at is what type of commitment is needed from companies to ensure that we bridge that implementation gap that I referred to earlier. Also looking at what ambition means for companies, what moving the needle means in practice as well, and what is needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So as the name says it's obviously really very much focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we also do have a specific ambition, one of 10, that is focusing on living wage, because we do think that this is really the level of ambition that is needed, again, to achieve the goals, and because living wage is relevant to almost all the goals, as well as the main, I would say, the main goal of the goals, which is to eradicate poverty. So this is actually a program with, again, a specific ambition attached to it, specific guidance on how to adapt it to your human resources processes, and with a space to engage with other companies, as well as local networks on connecting with key stakeholders and looking at the national legislative context, for example, and all these things.
This is great, Mary Lou. Thank you so very much. We're already getting questions coming in, so very informative talk. What I'd like to do now is actually turn it over to Dave Meyer. He's going to talk to, pardon me, ESG risk mitigation and reporting solutions. Dave, take it away.
Thanks very much, Jennifer, and appreciate the the long introduction, but you forgot the most important thing is that I roast my own coffee beans, and that's the most important attribute, because that's how we roll up here in the Pacific Northwest. If you go to the next slide, please, Charlotte. Great, thanks. And Mary Lou, thank you so much for kind of laying the foundation for what I'm going to talk about, particularly around some case studies around human rights and labor, which we can talk about in a little bit more. But I just wanted to kind of frame from my perspective and my experience where the real premise for environmental social governance is, and sustainability excellence, and that's really making sure that there's a nexus between environmental social governance management and business operations, and that they're really intertwined and linked, and all designed around continuous improvement. Then that creates sustained excellence. So if you go to the next slide. And I'm going to rip through this real fast because I want to make sure that we have enough time for Sharon's case study as well. as Jennifer knows, and many of you know, I've been doing this for over 4 decades, and we've seen lots of changes in this space in terms of reporting structures, in terms of business drivers through the course of the last couple of decades. But I think the proof's in the pudding now. It's not just anecdotal evidence, it's real evidence that you can make a strong business case for ESG in the workplace, from increased revenue and market share to reduced operational expenses, reducing your environmental footprint and enhancing environmental benefit, to reducing cost of risk and liability and cost of compliance, and in alignment with that, improved employee wellness and productivity. It really puts companies in a much better financial position, and particularly now in this world of transparency, where a lot of companies are being required to financially disclose what their ESG requirements are. That's becoming all the more important, and it helps to drive competitive advantage within a global marketplace. And it also enhances recruitment as well, and retention of best talent. So yes, you can go to the next slide. So how a company adopts ESG principles and actions, it's really critical to make sure that you're getting the most value from sustainability by strategizing a little bit and helping align the business mission and sustainability principles all together. So organizations often begin the journey of sustainability by asking, how can they use sustainability initiatives to improve business? How can we have the biggest impact? How can we manage the issues that matter the most to us and improve our current triple bottom line? And I'll talk about this in a little bit as well as Sharon. Should we adopt an international standard, or should we develop our own code of conduct, or should we do both? And there's lots of changes that are still going on, even in the course of the development of this webinar, that I'll talk about here in terms of the best structure to report to. Next slide. So what we often start with our customers is really trying to establish a current state and to establish a desired state. One of the examples that I have here is where we had a global customer that really asked us first to do a current state analysis of all of their risk management practices and then compare those against some established standards, like many of you on the call might be aware of, like ISO 14001, the Environmental Management Systems standard, as well as ISO 45001, which is the new Occupational Health and Safety standard, and then compare that also to their industry peers. So by approaching this in a more holistic way with our customer, we identified the issues that were higher priority to them, those that were higher risk aspects, higher risk issues from a human rights and labor perspective, and really to help understand and help them understand their current practices and where the gaps were. And then from that, we can then begin to identify best practices and provide recommendations to close the gaps, and then develop an implementation strategy and roadmap. Next slide. Another example is in the supply chain, and I'm going to talk about several of these examples in the next slides. We had a client that wanted to start looking at water-related risks and impacts for their global operations, and we more or less did a materiality assessment for them using supplier intelligence information and models that we have in our supply chain group to identify where local stresses were from an environmental perspective, and that's the ratio of withdrawal to supply. And we looked at local environmental management and governance issues as well to identify a series of core low risk to core high risk strategies, and then begin to identify where there were opportunities that companies had more or less control or influence over these issues to help drive development of corrective actions that would actually be meaningful and actionable for them. Next slide. Another example is around specifically the types of products that you're manufacturing, and then weighing those, whether it's packaging, palm oil, sugar, or cocoa in this example, and weighing them against human rights and working conditions, product traceability, and then material footprint and waste. And so we're using a category approach, looking at how we engaged or how our customers engaged with their suppliers in terms of influence, volume, relationship, et cetera. We started to map out the issues from a product and category perspective, where the organization may have the highest impact to the lowest impact. And that, again, allowed us over the course of time to develop actionable strategies specific to products and specific to packaging from a circularity approach to manage these types of ESG risks and opportunities in the food production cycle. Next slide. This is something too that I think a lot of organizations struggle with, particularly large global organizations. And Mary Lou referred to this in the human rights and labor area, where you have customers that may have a global supply chain of over 10,000 suppliers. It's very important to support supplier skills development and improvement and strengthen the skills of the global team and their suppliers. So we've, over the course of time, had a number and have set the stage for interactive workshops and improvement programs that were very interactive and can even be done remotely now in this age of COVID, that focuses on critical thinking and problem solving and change management, using management systems approaches as a diagnostic tool to finding gaps, and then helping suppliers to understand what their customers' key business practices are, whether they're supplier codes of conduct or other key business practices that they would like to align across their supplier organization. And the end product is to really emphasize supplier ownership of how they diagnose a problem and how they can develop a solution that meets not just the customer's requirements, but also enhances the supplier's operations as well. If you go to the next slide. There we go. So this is an example of a project that we're actually currently engaged in with a global apparel manufacturer, and have been doing so for quite a few years now, where we're engaging their suppliers in China around managing the supplier leadership requirements and around ESG issues. And it's kind of about a 3-month process, and it really starts with program foundation and starting to align the suppliers with what the supplier codes of conduct say. And then we're developing subject specific skills, processes, and identifying and documenting what the supplier leadership standards are and how they can go about within their own workplace, asking the right questions and doing diagnostic evaluations to assess whether or not they're aligned with the supplier codes. Then the next phase, in phase 3, is really developing that supplier improvement plan and implementing that plan, and then providing ultimately one-on-one support to them to continue to advance their compliance with suppliers' ESG codes. And then at the end, there's really more of a collaborative report out where all the participants can share their learnings along the way. This particular example, it's a little bit of an eye chart here, but what I really want to focus on is the subject, and that's on reducing excessive work hours. We even see these issues here in the United States when we go to customers' sites to do human rights and labor assessments as well. We find that excess work hours over and above what's allowable is still in play. And so we provided monthly support to customers via phone alongside a site visit by local staff. And the whole focus is on not just making sure that they're in compliance with appropriate codes, but improving work conditions. And then through the interactive dialogue, we're helping to close those gaps. And the real proof is in the pudding. We're finding that there's an improved reduction in worker turnover from 18 to 3%. There's reduced production defects and rework when you have more rested employees and engaged employees. And there's obviously much better controlled working hours. So by again, being more engaged and aligning your suppliers' expectations with your with your corporate expectations around ESG, that it can really make a huge difference in reducing excess work hours and improving workplace conditions. Next slide. So aligned with that, what we encourage our customers to do, and what we would encourage all of you to do, is think collaboratively and look for reciprocal value across your entire value chain. Talk to your customers, understand what they're looking to do, what they need to do, what their stakeholders are asking them to do, and then start working with your suppliers and the suppliers' suppliers to build that reciprocal value. That involves a lot of communication, a huge amount of collaboration, and then gathering the stakeholder interest to ultimately improve consumer value. That's our value in terms of what we choose at the end of the day. You go to the next slide. Now, a lot of organizations are struggling with, how do I capture all this information? They're being hit left and right by requests by their customers for ESG reporting. What we have found that there's a lot of software solutions that are available to organizations to manage environmental social governance data. That helps to drive efficiencies and monitor and track performance across a number of different physical locations, and creating real-time dashboards to improve reporting to impacted stakeholders. There are some solutions that also have multi-language support as well, and that can be developed or can be modified to report to different types of reporting frameworks, including, for instance, the Global Reporting Initiative. But there are always challenges in using process automation, because you want to make sure that whatever you choose is nimble enough and adaptable to your own workplace needs. Next slide. So there's been some questions raised, and I deal with this almost on a daily basis. I think all of us do, is which ESG emerging frameworks are most important? We may have some customers that say, I want to write a corporate social responsibility, the GRI, but then I start asking questions and mentioning that there's other reporting frameworks, that some that are very specific to climate change, like the CDP or the TCFD, and excuse me for my acronyms here, but they're listed there, or the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as Mary Lou had mentioned, or the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, which is now the Value Reporting Foundation as of 2 weeks ago, as they merge with the IIRC. So many acronyms, so many different emerging frameworks, and it's a real challenge even to those of us that are supporting our customers as well. The most important thing is to really understand what your options are, and then develop a framework that best matches what your needs are and what your customers' needs are. And then finally, to the next slide. So what I want to do is leave you with some tips for picking the proper ESG path to your desired state. And really, first, understand what drives your organization's need to report, first of all. Who do we need to report to? Why do we need to report? Where's the value for us in doing so? And then identify who's requesting those disclosures for you. Know what your stakeholders want, and choose that appropriate framework for reporting. And then by doing your research, by benchmarking against the various different reporting networks or frameworks, you should be able to identify what the best match is for your organization. And that helps drive your competitive advantage. And then finally, connect ESG reporting always to your core business strategy. This is not a static process. This is an ongoing, changing, evolving process. And now we'll have Sharon, I think, move on and give us her look at ESG reporting in action.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dave. That's a perfect lead into Sharon's talk, and an example of a company that did figure out early on to which standards they were going to report. And for those of you that haven't, read Illumina's most recent CSR report, I certainly encourage you to do so. It's an excellent piece of work. Anyway, Sharon, take it away.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be representing the corporate reporter for this panel, so I'll share a little bit about our CSR journey using Illumina as a case study for the industry perspective. So just a little bit about Illumina first. We are a genomics company and we provide DNA sequencing technologies. And genomics is an industry that intersects both biology and technology, so it doesn't fit into any single one category. And it's used these days now in everything from diagnosing rare disease to studying biodiversity in our environment. And it has been on the forefront of the COVID global response. We are headquartered in San Diego, California. Our revenues are over $3 billion a year, and we have almost 8,000 employees globally now. And over half of those actually reside in San Diego. In April of this past year, we just published our second annual corporate social responsibility report. So in terms of our CSR journey, we're still early in the maturity of the program. So no matter where you are in your own program development or the external reporting or the size of your company, I would encourage you to share and know that there's a path for you at whatever point you are in this journey. Next slide. So let me start with a few points that helped us make the business case for CSR and a few points that we use to socialize, why should we care about CSR? It is becoming increasingly important to investors, to potential talent, and to our customers. We can expect this trend to continue because more and more data is actually getting published showing correlations between CSR program strength and business performance. And both Mary Lou and David alluded to this, but between 2013 and 2020, companies that had high ESG ratings or on ESG, so environmental, social, and governance, they're outperforming peers on operating margins and annual returns by as much as 4 times that of those that are lower ESG performers. So investors are actually now using ESG to evaluate investment risk. But it's not just the investors that care either. I mean, just as Illumina is asking our suppliers to make commitments and exhibit specific behaviors, our customers and potential customers, of which we are their suppliers, have their own growing CSR requirements. We get tender requests or RFPs that have entire sections that are dedicated to evaluating what are our sustainability goals, what are our labor practices, and they want to know how is Illumina going to help them achieve or hinder their own CSR efforts. So existing customers continue to give us feedback on sustainability related topics in our customer experience surveys, and being able to share our CSR strategy and the focus areas by having an external voice and a CSR report has really added value for both the customer side and for talent acquisition, especially in the millennial and Gen Z space, so where we're trying to attract top talent. And it's critical for them. They want to be part of a company that has a connection to a broader mission, to a strong why. And even the Business Roundtable redefined the purpose of a corporation beyond shareholders to include all stakeholders. All right, so next slide. So at Illumina, prior to having a structured program, we had many elements of CSR. I mean, our HR team was working on progressive people programs and diversity and inclusion efforts. Our environmental health and safety teams were working with facilities on isolated energy conservation. Legal was working on board governance, but nothing that tied it all together. And externally, from a CSR standpoint, our report card was horrible because we weren't sharing anything about these programs. When we looked at peer companies that were getting some recognition, we either had equal or better programs, but because we didn't have a CSR website, we didn't have a CSR report, there was nothing showing our stakeholders that we had a strategy that tied our company mission to a purpose-driven CSR program. So we started with a materiality assessment, and that helped frame everything. So using a materiality assessment with stakeholder input and reviewing what is most material to our business for issues related to environmental, social, and governance, and then what was most important to our stakeholders, that's what allowed us to craft our CSR focus areas. And it helped us organize the program around the most significant issues of how Illumina could uniquely make an impact. So our company mission is linked to human health. So our program should look different than an industry that's in, say, construction. And once we identified what are our priorities, then we applied some of the principles of the frameworks out there. And we started with the United Nations Global Compact, which you heard about already a little bit. And they have a broad and holistic approach, and that made sure that we were connected to some kind of international framework. And then we looked at our CSR focus areas and we matched that up to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And you've heard a lot about both of those. So for us, the SDGs of good health, responsible consumption, reduced inequalities, gender equality, climate action, these all bubbled up in our materiality assessment. And that holistic approach helped us translate to these 5 focus areas. So for us, it's access to genomics, it's our community, environmental sustainability, and then what we call foundational pillars of where our people and operating responsibly, how we do business, really gets integrated into everything that we do. And then we started sharing. So we started with just qualitative commitments on our CSR page on our website. And then we started working on our inaugural CSR report. So before we even launched our first report, sharing just a little bit on the website actually helped gain some traction on external rankings. So it was clear that transparency is key, no matter where you are on that journey. Next slide, please. So our first CSR report launched in March of 2020, just as COVID was shutting down the world. So it didn't quite have the external, press or splash that we had expected, but it still helped us even in responding to COVID. And as we were developing that first report, we reviewed a lot of the different frameworks that are out there to help us guide what we should report and how. So we initially chose the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, as our reporting framework, especially for our first one, because it was the most comprehensive. And we felt that it gave us a roadmap to understand what we should report, what were the metrics and the topics, and that it would appeal to the most variety of our stakeholders. So that allowed us to facilitate data transparency and then also share the stories of what would bring the program to life for our reviewers. So following the release of that first report, there was overall very positive feedback, but an overwhelming response from the investor community that they were really looking for SASB and TCFD. They wanted to see more information about details on the financial impacts of sustainability and what were the opportunities and risks around climate change. So for our second report, we adopted and layered in the Sustainable Accounting Standard Boards, or SASB, and now they are under the more holistic framework that's just recently been integrated. And we used the recommendations from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, for the second report. Now, SASB uses industry-specific materiality. And so for us, the topics that they were calling out were mostly either covered under our GRI approach or were already relevant to our business and we were already tracking that information. TCFD, specifically called out by investors, and now even many global legislatures are calling as relevant. And that allowed us to look at climate opportunity and risk. So our second report was also the first time we had to report to the Global Compact on our communication of progress. And so having a central CSR report allowed us to layer that in and have one place for all our comprehensive CSR reporting. The other thing we included this year was having our energy data and emission response assured by a third party for verification. So there are, a number of reporting frameworks out there. There are just as many efforts to try and align them all. And meanwhile, there are calls for transparency and even legislation on these disclosures are increasing. So if you're just starting out, pick something, as David said, on what matches your business, and then be flexible and know that this is evolving and our stakeholders are getting more engaged and more informed. So be aware of, increasing requests. Next slide. The last thing I want to touch on is related to supply chain. And I mentioned on our CSR focus area that we approach the sustainability element as one of those focus areas. And we integrate that by having our sites with emission, energy, water, waste targets. We look at our products for design for environment principles and in our supply chain, which we've been focusing on today. So with the launch of our CSR report, our CSR goals included related to suppliers were on two main elements. One was on magnifying the impact by encouraging our own supply chain to make their commitments. And we started with a focus on our strategic suppliers. So you don't have to start with everything all at once, and you can identify where the potential impact could be. The other area we focused on initially was our diverse supplier program, and then expanded that beyond the US to incorporate even local to ensure that we're investing in the communities where we work and our employees are based. We know that the supply chain holds a tremendous amount of opportunity. So this year we're in the middle of gathering our Scope 3 data, which is the greenhouse gas emission impact from indirect categories like upstream our suppliers, the logistics, our business travel, employee commuting, how our customers use our product, what happens when they're done with it. And all of this data is going to help us drive, new targets, especially in our supply chain, and help us focus on, where are the elements of our value chain that will make the biggest impact. So for us overall, data has had tremendous power, and having visibility into these opportunities and risks, we think are going to help us mitigate and proactively, partner with our whole value chain. It is constantly evolving, but we believe partnering with our suppliers and our business partners, our entire value chain, in order for all of us to be good corporate citizens, that this is going to be a win for our company, it will be a win for our business partners, and ultimately will lead to more sustainable and equitable future for us all. And I'll pause there and make sure we have enough time to get to some of your questions. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you very much. And thanks to all three of you as well. We do have some questions that have come in, and it's perfect timing because we do have a bit of time to go through a handful of these. We talked a little bit about the various different frameworks that are out there, and how, just recently, a couple of weeks ago, we had the SASB merger. Do you think this is a trend? Do you think we're going to see more of this, or do you think this is just a fluke? What are your thoughts on that? And Dave, maybe I'll start with you. I'll put you on the spot.
I don't think it's a fluke. I think for those of us that have been involved in this field for many years, we've always seen an evolution in sustainability standards and reporting structures. There were efforts many years ago to actually develop a sustainability guideline, not a guideline, but a standard, which kind of unfortunately fell by the wayside, a common framework that organizations can use, and it may come back. It's hard to say, but we're also seeing a lot of industries specifically come up with their own standards. The Responsible Business Alliance has been around for many years, the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, and several more that I'm familiar with and have been working with. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some more changes, some more consolidation. I think that it's all good in that it's really putting organizations in a position where they can report that's in alliance with their own specific needs. So it's all good. What we want to avoid is just having dozens and dozens of different standards out there. Some consolidation would always be a good thing. Sharon, you're kind of living this on the front lines. I'd like to get your interpretation.
Yeah, I don't think it's a fluke. I think there will be a continued effort. And I think COVID helped escalate the need for transparency and consistency. At the same time, I think that industry is calling for the flexibility to report on what matters most to their business. So to be able to balance having something that investors and regulators can compare company to company, but also have enough flexibility that an industry in oil and gas and somebody who is making medicine can report in the way that means the most for their business and to make changes.
And that was another question that came in too, is do these policies and frameworks, do they need to be industry sector specific in order for us to derive value, or can they be generic enough where you can apply to your own business, oil and gas as well as retail, but still provide investors with an opportunity to compare apples to apples? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's similar in terms of the reporting, and we've seen a lot of that in even the investor indices that are out there on how they measure, and a lot of them are looking at ESG risk, and then how well does the company mitigate those risks, and so that I think is where that transparency comes into play. I mean, every industry is going to have some level of risk. The idea is that driving encouragement to report will cause action and will allow companies or force companies to measure, what is the risk, and then how do you reduce that. And so I think that's the first step, but I would expect to see even some variation with some core elements that are required, so that there is a consistent set of data, and then having an element of opportunity to have flexible per industry.
That makes sense. I'm wondering if Mary Lou, you can address a little bit about the types of companies and the business sectors that are represented, that are adhering to the UN Global Compact principles and the Decent Work program. Is that a broad-based industrial sector? Do they tend to come from specific sectors?
Yeah, it's a pretty broad base, I would say. All sectors are represented and all sides. As I said earlier, we have about 60% of signatories that come from, that are small and medium-sized enterprises. The bigger companies tend to be more from Europe, or a bit less from North America, but still. So in all cases, I think the way we work is really to not look too much into sectors, although it is important to address the risks that are specific to your own industry, and partner with both industry peers as well as companies from other sectors. But we don't really have this approach of looking specifically at what is applicable to specific sectors. As for the Decent Work Action Platform, it's actually the same, but given that it's a platform looking at advancing human rights and labor in supply chains, we do have mostly big buyers who have a pretty large supply chains and operations in most countries. And I mean, it's all public, right? We apply our own preaching on transparency on ourselves, but it's companies that you well know, Unilever, Total, Shell, Inditex. So you see oil and gas, garment, H&M, garment, also a very different type of companies, basically. And I think that's also on our side, the added value of these platforms is that it put people that would not necessarily connect with each other in other circumstances. So it complements industry-specific initiatives, which are equally important. It's just that you probably need both to understand how to make progress.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, that makes sense. One of the topics that's come up quite a bit today is the social equity and labor in the supply chain. How do you, manufacturers have deadlines, timelines, production deadlines, and that pressure gets pushed into the supply chain, right? And suppliers feel pressure to turn things around just as quickly. And sometimes that can have consequences on working conditions, worker health, et cetera. Just maybe in the last couple of minutes that are left, how do you manage that? How either as a company or as an advisor, how do you manage that challenge?
I mean, it's obviously not an easy fix. I think it relates to very, sometimes conflicting positioning within a company between sustainability goals and the pressure, the financial or business pressure that you have to outsource to produce your products. And this was the very first mandate that we had within the action platform. Companies said this is our main challenge as big buyers is to reconcile those two opposing goals on being, sourcing the best possible product at the best possible price versus making sure that we don't enable low standards on labor as a result. We developed a guide on that, the Essence Toolkit for Sustainable Procurement, that is very much based on engaging with suppliers themselves to understand better the challenges that they face, increase leverage, reducing the number of suppliers that you have. I mean, there are different ways you can ensure a better working relationship with your suppliers, thus understanding better the impact of your procurement decisions. But at the end of the day, the procurement people in an office, if they don't have a clear mandate and flexibility, I mean, there's nothing they can really do at the end of the day. So you really do need to have strong leadership policies in place and give the tools that procurement needs to make that assessment, and not choose only on the basis of, again, the cheapest possible price.
Thank you, Marie Lou. I think, Dave, did you have a couple comments? We're at the top of the hour here.
I know we're at the top of the hour, but it's the old carrot and stick. A lot of companies, they really make mandates and they go to companies and assess them, and if they're not in compliance, then they issue some corrective actions. But being collaborative through the examples that we showed, the carrot, I think, has long-term benefits despite some of the short-term risks.
No, this is great stuff. I can't thank you enough, David Meyer, Mary Lou DuPont, and Sharon Vidal. And those of you that have attended today, we've gotten some really great questions. We couldn't get to all of them. I apologize, but we will do so afterwards. I want to encourage everyone to visit our Learning Center at learningcenter.sourceintelligence.com. Lots of great information there via webinars, on-demand, blogs, infographics, etc. We have a promotion going on now as well. For those of you that are interested in, no matter where you are in your journey, as Sharon said, whether you're just starting or have a robust program, but with our own automated supply chain ESG reporting solution. So we encourage you to take advantage of this as well. Thank you, everybody. Apologize, we went a minute or so over, but of tremendous value. Thanks very much, and we look forward to seeing you all back here in the not so distant future. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you for your time, everyone.
Take care.